Hey everyone, welcome back to the Environmental Podcast. It's episode 3 of our Modern Times series, and we're talking about modern art and a little bit of architecture.
Really exciting episode. To prepare for it, I learned a lot about modern art history, things that I'd never really studied before, more just admired.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one too, because I feel like it's kind of a return to our roots.
Yes.
We're asking questions about things which we thought that we knew a lot about, but it turns out we probably don't.
That is entirely true.
So the structure of this episode is that basically Alicia's going to give us a bit of a chronology, a timeline of modern art and the styles, and maybe mix in some architecture in there as well. And I have provided some hypotheses, which are basically thoughts that I had about modernity and modern art and the kind of psychology behind abstraction, I guess.
Yeah.
And we're going to put them to the test and see if they're actually true, if they're just kind of beliefs which I had deluded myself into thinking that I was intelligent for holding.
Cool.
Did you want to talk about anything else before we started? Did you watch or read anything interesting in the last week?
Finished Murder on the Orient Express yesterday.
Yeah, I think we watched the 70s version with Albert Finney playing Hercule Poirot, and it was very underwhelming to say the least.
Yes.
Terrible accent.
Bad accent. Not a super strong conclusion.
No.
That was the only movie I finished this week. Yeah, so let's jump into modern art.
Okay.
So modernism was a movement that was actually a collection of movements. There was the Renaissance, so all the really realistic paintings that were inspired by deities commissioned by royalty. And then there came realism, which was a response to the really flamboyant and decorated paintings.
Okay.
And so realism was still painting things super realistic, but there was no...
Realistic subject matter now, right? Not mythology.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but there was no blemish correcting. It was all very raw and tried to convey things as they were.
Mm-hmm.
And then following that came modernism, which was an extension of realism, in my opinion, because it was, again, trying to represent things, experiences as they are, but they went a step farther and were representing emotions, the light, movement, and I'll get a bit more into that as I go through the different movements that made up the modernist.
Okay, so you've just talked in really broad strokes.
Yes.
So do you know the dates for these, or what times these things were taking place, or even who we can say is kind of representative of Renaissance, modernist, realist?
I focused almost entirely on modernism,
Okay.
which began in the late 19th century, really late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
It came about pretty much with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And
So that's going to be our focus today, guys.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. We probably should have said it outright. The question is, or the questions will be about what aspects of industrialization and a kind of technological world that we're living in since circa 1900 have prompted a change in art, or have they?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question.
Something I learned while researching this, I want to preface my history of modern art, because when you think about art that was thousands of years ago, it was all abstract. It wasn't super realistic because there wasn't the techniques, the tools. So the art history that we know and are really taught in North America is a super Eurocentric art. But modernism came about when art started to become less Eurocentric and there was more globalization. So at the end of the 19th century, the Impressionists came to be. This was the first movement of the modernist movement. Impressionists are Degas, Monet, Renoir, Cézanne,
Manet.
Munch.
Yeah, all of our favorites basically.
Yeah.
So let's just describe the art.
Yeah.
Oh, and also we say modern art because we had a bit of a conversation before the episode about what kind of art are we going to be talking about.
Oh, yes.
Because we figured, in our kind of ignorant ways, that the conversation will be much the same depending on, regardless of the medium rather.
Exactly.
So we said literature, paintings, music, whatever it may be. We thought the conversation is probably going to be the same as it comes to the psychology, because even though those, poets exist in a different space to painters, they are, depending on the time and the place, subject to the same sociological forces.
Yeah.
But we just thought we'd focus on paintings for the most part.
Yeah.
because that's what people usually associate with modern art.
Yeah.
And it seems representative of the times.
Everyone's familiar with the modern artists
Good
and
point.
paintings
Yep.
as well, so they can kind of draw images in their head as we discuss them.
Yeah, well said.
And that's the thing with the modernist movement, is it spanned probably, like the movement itself really spanned 40 years, so 1900 till 1940 was really when all of the different branches of it popped up, and they were all united by a response to wanting to go against traditional ways of thinking about art, history, expectations. Different thoughts about God were represented in these, a lot more based on science even.
All these things.
Yeah, so that's what united the modernists across mediums, across actual styles. So impressionists were the first ones. They really focused on light and color, representing those in a more honest way to how the painter experienced the world, experienced the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they were more like broad brush strokes as well.
Yeah, it was, it was the emotion of the scene.
Yeah.
Rather than just the strict realism of the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And this is probably good to mention at the start. You said it's the tail end of the 19th century, so the beginning of the 1900s really, which matches up pretty well with the camera.
Yes.
Photography. So that, before we get into any kind of psychological drives to abstraction,
Mm-hmm.
that's a pretty big cause on the surface, which is that photorealism could be achieved now in a way which is more perfect than or more accurate than could ever be done by paint, by paintbrush.
So people wanted to start doing more, I think, with the medium.
Well, I think they realized they had to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
I'd imagine it would be quite disheartening at that time to have been like a classically trained painter for 40 years of your life, and then the camera comes along and you're like, oh, well, they don't need me anymore. There's probably a little bit of that for sure.
Yeah, a lot of these painters were classically trained, and they actually just were known for their classical pieces before they started getting into abstraction. And there was one, it wasn't a direct quote, but it was from like the Modernist manifesto, which was that the painters and the artists, they believed that they could make art objectively better, which is like a really broad claim, I think.
Objectively better than what?
It used to be.
Than it had been made before?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just thought that was neat. The next movement was post-impressionists, who were Van Gogh, most famously. So there were the impressionists. Van Gogh, the difference with post-impressionism was that they had a more clear subject matter, with the surroundings painted more abstractly. So you think of Starry Night, the city is painted as you would paint a silhouette of a city, then the sky is more of an expression of how the experience was.
Yeah.
Then came the Cubists. You're a big Cubist guy.
I love Cubists.
Yeah. So who are some...
I mean, I only know Picasso pretty much.
Yeah. The others I hadn't heard of. I'd seen their paintings, though, because they probably would be very easily mistaken as a Picasso painting.
Okay.
So there's Brock and Grease.
Brock and Grease.
Yeah. And their paintings basically just look like Picasso's. So they're more about taking shapes, kind of mixing up different viewpoints of
Cubism.
one moment.
I remember I had a class that was essentially all about modern art 2 years ago, and we learnt the 7 tenets of Cubism. I can't say I have memorized them all, but I remember one of them was that we see different perspectives all at once, or in some cases all the perspectives all at once. So it was still a subject. It was still, as they say in art, representational. Mm-hmm. Picasso, when he's painting those 3 women, it was still 3 women, as much as they didn't look like 3 women as we see them with our eyes. Yeah. And that differs from what I'm guessing will be coming later on.
Yeah, that's the thing. I didn't put like dates for all these because they kind of just popped up really quickly,
and
all in different places.
The thing is, it's nice to list art periods as if it was just this one ended in this year and then the next one began, but it's not really like that.
No, not at all, really. Something this reminded me of, though, a lot of these popped up in different locations while different isms were rising up at the same time. So there was like communism, capitalism, fascism, they're all like popping up around the world, and these kind of popped up in response to them because the painters felt like the modern, we'll get into that later, but it was just remember, these all popped up alongside the other...
Right, political context, social context.
Yeah. So what's next? Fauvism?
Fauvism, yes.
Yes. That was all about, I put color, exclamation point.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just like they were kind of, it'd be like as if I drew something and then just put some watercolors in the background.
Yeah.
Obviously much better than that. Matisse,
yeah, I love him and his
Yeah.
collages. He was probably the first artist who I actually learned about because of my art
Mhm.
class in one of my art classes in high school. Our teacher was a huge fan of Matisse,
Okay.
Henri Matisse, and he made us do collages in his style, and of course they didn't turn out anywhere near as well, but there's something really endearing about seeing a group of grade 10 kids, try their best at replicating some old French master.
Yeah. So this again is kind of, it's just another version of abstraction. It's really focused on the emotion of the scene or the
Mhm.
moment. I have 10 of these listed, so we'll get through them.
Yeah,
Futurism is next.
the
It
Italians.
was, likening humans to machines.
Yes, futurism is probably one of the most scary things I've ever learned about.
Yeah, and it came up in 1909.
Yeah, because I
So
remember
imagine now.
reading their manifesto,
Yeah.
and I think it was written all in caps, and it was published in a newspaper because they were that type of group. And it
Yeah.
was basically all about how the past is dead. We must kill it. Everything's about movement, speed. They loved industry and technology and driving fast cars and
Mhm.
motor cars, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And it was also, this is the only real mention of any other art form. I mentioned writing because they were like getting rid of adverbs and adjectives, just focusing on the action of the infinitive verbs.
Yeah, they were also fascists, weren't they?
Seems like it.
I think they were.
Yeah. They probably didn't think they were like doing bad. I mean, no one who's a fascist probably thinks they're doing bad, but that's kind of the vibe I got. But to try and describe it to you, it looks kind of retro to me.
Really?
Yeah.
I have written down like one of my favorite quote-unquote modern art pieces is a futurist sculpture.
Mhm.
It's by Brent Cousy, who was kind of one of their forerunners.
Okay.
Forerunners, is that the word?
One of their leaders,
Yeah, one of their leaders, one of their pioneers.
Yeah.
And the sculpture is called Bird in Space. I think I've showed it to you, and it's just kind of I suppose it looks kind of like a headless bird
Mhm.
in that it is an organic looking shape, albeit very slick and metal,
Mhm.
that comes to a point, and it's on kind of a plinth, I guess you'd call it. And I thought that was really interesting. The reason I wanted to mention that one is because of the relationship between its form, so the sculpture, and its title,
Mhm.
Bird in Space. But I guess that's something we'll be talking about later.
Yeah. No, that's a really great indication of the modern art movement that I haven't mentioned yet.
It's about intent,
The
right?
titles having,
Yeah.
purpose. Cool. Vorticism is another.
Vorticism?
It's basically futurism, just English.
English futurism.
Yeah.
Interesting.
They wanted their own name. It came up a little bit later. And yeah. Next is Constructivism, which was a Russian art movement that came along with communism. They wanted everything to have a purpose. The art was made out of materials like metals and glass and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it was to serve a societal purpose and not just be an abstract statement.
Yeah, that's the theme running through all these as well, is they often like to play with material, right?
Mm-hmm.
Picasso did that as well with a lot of his collages.
Yeah.
Recycling even, I guess you could use that word.
Yeah.
I think part of it was, well, probably that can characterize a lot of these movements is a bit of a look at us, we're different from the classic styles, and we're kind of, a little bit of it was probably rebelling without a cause.
Yeah.
But of course there was validity to a lot of the
Mhm.
intent as well.
Yeah. I read that Picasso got a lot of inspiration from masks that were brought over during, I don't remember when, but
Okay.
they were brought over to wherever he lived, and he saw them and he like collected them. And because they would often represent multiple spirits or
Yes, I've heard
animals
this
all
as
in
well.
one. And so that's kind of what started his trying to show a bunch of things in
I
one.
think that this is a theme which is emerging, which I think I love from this episode, because I didn't actually think about it at all until today, which is the fact that modernism seems to have just picked up the baton from
Yeah.
ancient art.
Yeah.
I love that. I think that's such a cool idea,
I think so as well.
because we think of it, or it's so often demeaned as just a regression from the high art, the classical art, which you called Eurocentric, and I agree with that. I think it's a little bit Eurocentric, but it's even more just like a recency bias thing,
Yeah, it's true.
because it's not like that kind of primitive even primitive is, I know it's not the word we're supposed to use. It's not like that kind of ancient art wasn't around in Europe as well.
Yeah, it's true.
It was. It's just that it's, as it has with from other places, been kind of thrown by the wayside for, 16th, 17th, 18th century paintings. Which
whatever's modern is always considered the best.
Yeah.
And this is probably the first time that it's been like a divide, being like, maybe this isn't the best. Maybe what was old was better. But yeah, that's picking up the baton is a good way to put it. Because that's what I was thinking of as well. Because it's like, even as far back as there's been documentation, like cave drawings are super abstract, but they tell a story. They could convey to us thousands of years later the emotion that people were feeling, the activities that they were doing. So I think it's more effective.
Well, I don't know if you're the one to say that, but if you find it more effective, then you can say that.
More effective. So then I have another 3 listed here, which are all, they just kind of are getting us towards pure abstraction.
Okay.
There's supermatism, which is another Russian movement, paintings in only shapes, so just like triangles and
Any
squares
polygons?
and stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
Distilli. Pure abstraction. This one had a spiritual influence. That was the only mention I had in all of these about any kind of return to spirituality. But they were like talking, the paintings weren't talking. The paintings were a lot about like transcending, interacting with the galaxy, interacting with senses and consciousness.
Yeah, and it was deliberately abstract, you say.
Yeah, and
we've talked about that in other episodes, right? And that's what, I'm not sure what kind of masks Picasso was looking at, but a lot of the ancient kind of shaman masks were deliberately exaggerated and, what would you say, strange looking, exaggerated expressions and things like that, because it was not supposed to represent humanity. It was supposed to represent something else, something more, something that we don't know exactly what it looks like, but we know it doesn't look like us. So I think that was, even if it wasn't immediately, deliberately spiritual, a lot of the modern paintings, I feel like that was a thing. That's a part of it.
I think it's more about consciousness.
Especially when you think about what we have always painted, which has been the divine.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the unknown, rather.
Yeah.
I think if you want to talk about it as our conception of the divine or the unknown has changed such that rather than an ornate painting by Titian, some biblical scene, it's just, shapes, geometry, not supposed to be, or rather, should I say, not consciously by the artist representing the same thing, but, possibly representing the same thing just in a way which is differently informed by the times. I think that's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, I think
and
so
I think,
as well.
because I think you're going to mention Carl Jung and as well as Freud, I think they would probably say something like that. The psychoanalysts would probably say something like that, that despite these modernist groups saying that their art was about this, they would say actually it was probably about this.
Cool.
Anyway.
So I have 2 more movements. There was Dadaism. This was Marcel Duchamp with the fountain. And I learned today that the fountain was a part of a whole series called The Ready-Mades, which was he went and he bought a bunch of like mass-produced items and he just like altered them a little bit, positioned them, signed them, and put them into a gallery. Everyone hated it because fountain was just a urinal, I believe. Yeah, with a scribble signed on by him or something. Yeah.
That was a breakthrough piece. Because I'd imagine, okay, let's say everything up to now, the average person on the street would see a Picasso and they'd be like, oh, that's kind of weird, but also very cool. I can see the skill involved and stuff. And going on with the sculptures as well, I'm sure they'd say similar.
Yeah. The skill, that's a good, Yeah,
and then they'd see Duchamp's fountain and they'd be like, that's not art. So the question is, why is that art or why isn't it art? What do you think? I feel like that's kind of where I don't want to say draw the line because I'm pretty open to art. But if I had to say this is where it like cuts off, it's when it's something that, but it does take skill to like think of the concept and assemble the exhibit. So there's a conceptual skill and then there's the skill of execution. Yes. The skill of execution is Rembrandt being able to paint this incredible landscape or whatever, or portrait. And the skill of concept is Brancusi with the bird in space, it being about speed, movement,
Yeah.
all these things.
Drawing attention to things that we aren't conscious of, but making us aware of them.
Yeah, I guess you would possibly say that these ones are more about context, more about materials, more about all the things that aren't just the thing.
Yeah.
The thing itself.
The aura. You've
Aura.
told me a bit about that before.
Yeah. I wish I'd remember more terms from that class because we talked all about this.
Yeah. But it's just like if you saw, it's like when there's the black canvas at the Tate or whatever.
Yes.
It's how the light is interacting the shadows from the people in the room. It's like, it's about the personal experience. And
well, it's not, I don't even mean that yet.
No.
That's what I would say is something different. Because when we're talking about fountain, there's none of that.
Yeah, that's true. Fountain is more in the materials, intentions. Sorry.
The intention, yeah. It's about Duchamp having some idea, which probably about, let's be honest, it was mostly just probably knowing Duchamp, him saying, I'm going to be audacious and cause a stir and do this thing.
Yeah.
Not knowing that he made probably the most important piece of art in the 20th century, from what I can tell.
Yeah.
I think this is another common theme in modern art for the last 100 years, is that it's not about the representation, it's about the act of representing. You know, it's a really self-aware thing, which is why when you talk about, and they're always in the news, it'll be like some crazy new art exhibit, which is just, you know, a famous one from, I think it was an English artist, it was just her bed. And people are like, how is this art? You know, there was no skill in putting it together. The skill is all in the idea behind it. And she could probably write essays on what it's supposed to mean, you know, what she meant behind it. And that's what most people couldn't do. But the problem is you don't see that just looking at the canvas, whereas you do see it just looking at the canvas in kind of classical works. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So the final one of the movements that I wanted to draw attention to, there were more, this wasn't an exhaustive list.
Yeah.
But was surrealism.
Ooh, Dali.
Dali? Yes. 1931. So this was kind of the tail end of the modernist movement. Then we get into postmodernism, which we've talked about before, and I'm sure we'll talk about more in the future. But Salvador Dali, you'll probably know him for his paintings in the persistence of memory. So it's like the melted clock and the slumped over horse.
Isn't there something to do with an ear as well? In one of the famous ones, there's an ear.
Yeah. So this was Freud and Nietzsche. They both lived right at the beginning of this era, of the modernist era.
Yeah.
And their psychological findings and research really informed this push for turning away from the traditional expression of art.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that modernism was about kind of, in part, releasing any shackles which might have been put on the artist by society or by what was expected of art, and getting to actual truth of emotion and kind of undoing any learnt inhibitions or repressions or something. And that's definitely something Freud would be, you know, basically getting out pure representations of the subconscious.
Yes. And so these paintings were the most inspired by Freud. Yeah. They were representing all sorts of things, but surrealism was representing absolute reality, is how the manifesto went. Yeah.
Absolute reality, because I love that so much.
Yeah.
Because it's just that I don't particularly enjoy looking at the surrealist images. You know,
sometimes they're
grotesque, right?
Yeah,
it's a little bit of body horror almost sometimes.
Yeah.
So to call it absolute reality when it's not realism, it reminds me of this quote, which is that fiction is truer than true, because it's truth, you know, it's reality, it's lessons, it's morals, and it's, what would you say, a shared interpretation, a shared subconscious interpretation of reality condensed into a story. And surrealism is kind of like that.
Yeah. It's condensing like the human experience into one canvas or one sculpture. Surrealism is crazy, but it's just like all these different categories just show you it was like there was just like a chain on like artists, then it was like snapped, and it just went every different direction.
Of freedom, creativity.
But they all had the same intention and same, for the most part, all over the world, things were globalizing, industrializing, and that's probably where we can now get into a bit more of the discussion of the modern times in relation to art.
So my very first hypothesis, we might have already gone over it a bit, but I thought this would be a good place to start, taking no assumptions. So my first hypothesis is this. Modern times, have brought a rise in mainstream paintings which are abstract instead of realistic.
Okay.
Because most people would take that for granted, but I really wanted to get into it, especially with what we were saying about ancient stuff.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, is this actually true? First of all, is this true? Because even when we were just talking about, okay, well, let's say it's obviously true in terms of the 20th and 21st century in comparison to the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th,
Yeah.
all those. Because those paintings which were accepted and deemed high art were mostly realistic, and today's paintings which are deemed high art are mostly non-representational or abstract. That's fact.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to question whether it came from nowhere or whether it was actually more of an evolution rather than a revolution. I know we're saying that industrialization, changed things rapidly, and it definitely did happen quickly.
Yes.
But it's just that, let's say the black canvas, it didn't just go straight from realism to that. And you just said there were stages to this, starting with the Impressionists.
Yeah, really starting with the realists, who were like, no, we're not going to do deities anymore or anything supernatural.
But even that, the deities, the supernatural, it was stylized.
Yeah.
And even religious art was, deliberately stylized.
Yeah, there was like adornments.
Yeah. And when we're talking about Dali and the surrealists, well, that seems a lot like Bosch. That was kind of surrealist imagery, which he was painting.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make those connections.
Okay.
And especially, so that's kind of a few hundred years separated those guys. And then we were talking about the ancient art was pretty abstract. You look at totem poles.
Yeah.
But the ones that I wanted to mention were the pyramids.
Okay.
Because everybody today, will consider those incredible feats of engineering and of kind of art and of astronomy, conceptual, as well as the execution. But that wasn't depicting anything realistically, No. They're big triangles.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting when we get to modern geometry and people say, what's that? It's just shapes.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that a silly comparison to make?
I don't think so. It's where it comes from. I had a thought. It might have been inspired by a podcast I was listening to. I can't remember because it happened while I was listening to the podcast.
Okay.
It was that there's a finite amount of inspiration and it's constantly being recycled, and artists are constantly exchanging it.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Closed system.
So I feel like it's not a silly comparison to make, because the inspiration for the pyramids and ancient art maybe just kind of came back around. And
yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to go off the deep end a bit with this.
All right.
So art is our representation of how we see the world. Geometry and shapes are the simplest forms of representation.
Yep.
Humans throughout kind of view things at different levels of representation.
Yes.
Language is a form of representation.
Yep.
That thing that we call a bench, we just say that word and we call it that, but it isn't bench, it isn't BENCH, we just call it that. It's just a label. And we do it, so that's kind of a label for things, and then we do things the other way around, which is why we watch cartoons, because those aren't real people.
Yeah.
But they're drawings of them.
Yeah.
Kind of like the
think in
hieroglyphics.
Abstractions, we
think in abstractions.
Yeah.
And I just think no one level is better, or maybe even more refined than any other. They're just different levels.
Yeah.
So something like, let's say a really hastily drawn comic sketch isn't inherently any more of a maybe valid representation of the world than a really detailed cartoon.
Yes.
So I just think we use all levels of those in our minds. We need all levels of those. And so in ancient times as well as now, in addition to complex pictures, we need simple ones.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
That makes sense. Some of these artists in their manifestos, their journals and things mention that making art more abstract made it more accessible to people, because it's just easier to understand.
That's true. And also, this might be a really practical observation, but you mentioned globalization, and that was definitely true.
Yeah.
This is inherently transcendental of culture and dogma, usually there aren't people,
Yeah.
so they aren't drawing on specific religious references for sure, which people from other continents may not get.
Yeah.
It's
There's no
a really
idealized version of
of a
human
particular place.
or a place. Yeah.
It's a very universal thing.
Yeah.
No language, or mostly.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Okay, so that's the first hypothesis.
Okay.
Modern times have brought a rise in mainstream paintings being abstract instead of realistic. True, but not so abrupt as it may seem. Another hypothesis. I'll just say word for word what I wrote because this is a muddled thought of mine. This change has occurred in part because of industrialization, increased speed of the modern world, a lack of fixity in things, humanity's shifting perspective of themselves and of the world around them, hyper-awareness, the horrors of the 20th century, and a move away from God.
Yes.
Big list. Lots to unpack. All of them true? I think all of those were covered even just with the 10 movements which you mentioned.
Yeah, I think so.
I think all of those were covered just with the futurists, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely difference between the religious nature of paintings prior to...
Yeah, something needs to fill that gap.
Yeah.
Because before, 1800?
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know, but I think before around 1800, art in Europe was paintings of Bible scenes.
Yeah.
Or biblical characters, or biblical iconography, let's say, or portraits.
Yeah.
Or landscapes. I think that was it.
Seems like it.
And there
even
was
all
some
around the
classical
world.
references as well, which were still, again, mostly about the gods.
Yeah, so about like Zeus or Olympus.
Yeah.
I think around the world that seems to be the case because when you talk about, even just from where we live, like the indigenous art that we see, the traditional ones are often depicting their
spirits.
Yeah,
I just didn't want to make any, assertions on things I didn't know, but I suspect that's true.
Yeah, seems like it's the case everywhere.
And that, is kind of the main point of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
God is gone from society.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of being like the standard, it's not how it once was. And so basically people need to focus, or people will focus on different things.
Yeah, I mean, this all came about with the rise of science and industry.
Mm-hmm.
People were focused on progress, we now knew how people's brains worked to an extent. There was less mystery, maybe.
Yeah.
More idols.
Yeah.
To be depicted, to try and be understood, represented. Our human experience became a lot more complex than it ever was before.
Okay, horrors of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Definitely, right?
Mm-hmm.
We were watching that video today about a German soldier, I think, in World War I, who made a point of saying, my art is, a comfort for me because of all the, the trench warfare and things like that. And that was World War I.
Yeah.
And there was worse to come for a lot of countries.
Yeah. This was all... Yeah, this whole movement was basically surrounding the First World War and was trying to understand it, trying to bring comfort, maybe trying to express the human
comfort
experience.
is a good word.
Yeah.
It's basically our world got bigger than ever. We see more pain and suffering on a daily basis if you are kind of a masochist who wants to follow the news, or if you are unfortunate enough in the 20th century to be involved in a war, as tons of people were. And that kind of exposure to the depths of human suffering, it makes you find comfort in, let's say, simpler representations of the world, or of pain, or of emotion, or whatever it may be. Different things will speak to you. Yeah. Okay, I didn't mention this, but I remember making this note 2 years ago, just before I went to sleep, and it just said James Joyce, Einstein, Picasso.
Okay.
Because I was reading the Einstein biography at the time. Mm-hmm. He was a pioneer of relativity.
Yes.
And there was kind of a philosophical and artistic thread in the early 20th century called relativism.
Okay, yeah.
Which is that nothing's true, nothing's objective. It all just depends. And people kind of misconstrued Einstein's findings to say that he had found the same thing scientifically. Yeah. Which was not the case, but I think it was just a similarity of the words. Yeah. But I guess wanted to make the point that there were scientific breakthroughs which were changing, and I have this in the list, humanity's perspective,
Yeah.
which were, I think, inspiring or at least providing a good backdrop for the artistic ones.
Yeah. Really, that's interesting to have a good example of how a scientist or a world leader was, changing how we thought about how objects and people interacted.
Yeah, Einstein was hugely famous. He was the world's first big celebrity. So
Yeah.
celebrity is another thing that we're thinking about here, especially
Yeah.
a common criticism against the modernists is their ego, and they're very self-absorbed and things like that.
Yeah. Do you have any other ones? I have a couple things I want to say, but they'll probably be at the very end.
Okay, next hypothesis. Most people don't like modern art because they were raised on realism, which is very immediately impressive, and because it is deemed to be more skillful.
That makes sense.
Or deemed to take more skill to create, let's say.
Yeah.
And is that true?
No.
No, you don't think?
No. I used to be in that camp. I thought I was like above everything else because I was like, why do people like this garbage? Like, kids could make that.
Yeah,
But
that's what everyone says. My kid could
exactly.
make that.
But it's like it takes this level of understanding that most people just don't have to be able to take inspiration from a child's painting, from a Renaissance painting, from a light bulb, combine it all, and convey a message without saying any words.
Yeah.
I think that's just what artists have always done. They've always captured reality in a way that no one else can.
I think you can maybe say as a general rule that the more abstract a painting is, the deeper level of interpretation it requires to appreciate. You know, which is why there's kind of the common complaint about high art critics and fans alike, that they are just, snobs.
Yeah.
Or that it's kind of like an emperor's new clothes situation, that everyone's kind of fawning over an all black canvas, and it's like they're in on some joke that no one else gets.
Yeah.
And I think there is a huge element of snobbery from what I can tell.
Oh, 100%.
But I also think there's a legitimate, appreciation that you can have for it. I do think it's a learned appreciation, and I do think that's because we were all, to an individual, raised on more realistic paintings. Pretty much no one was raised on modern art and then introduced to realistic paintings.
No.
But I think that would be
Interesting.
very interesting.
Yeah. It's the thing we were taught to color in the lines and paint as realistically as possible. Yeah.
Here was my kind of follow-up to that. It's that people get, and it's not even that they just don't understand it. I think deep down that it's kind of an anger that they feel because they deem the celebration of modern art to be seen as like an assault on the idea of an objective aesthetic judgment.
Yeah.
So when people say that black canvas or that blue dot is as much a masterpiece as the Mona Lisa,
Yeah.
people get angry about that because it's deemed that's kind of representative to them of a relativism, which is dangerous. We want standards. We were talking about this last week.
Yeah.
It's good to have standards, aesthetic ones, maybe especially.
Yeah.
And I also think this is where the kind of crossover with atheism and politics and religion comes in, because what I just said, the absence of an objective judgment, that's the same thing.
Yeah.
But what I wrote in response to that was that you can love the Rembrandt for its skill, and as well as the Van Gogh, as well as the Picasso. Those are all different levels of abstraction, but they're all representational. That's the key thing.
Yeah.
Starry Night was still a landscape,
Yeah.
and Picasso's paintings are still of things, usually.
Not just concepts.
Yeah, all of those are representational but have different levels of realism. And I said you love the Kandinsky or the Reinhardt or the Warhol, not just for its image. You can like those, we can like the way those colors and shapes look.
Yeah.
And, usually we do, just because we like those kinds of images. Not everyone does, and that's fine.
No.
But you don't love them mostly for those. And I don't think many people would say that the actual images on the canvas, if it's just some dots or shapes, quote unquote, just those things are as impressive or as well rendered as, a classic portrait or landscape.
Yeah.
But you can love those things, sometimes for their images, but mostly for the meaning behind it. The intent is everything.
Yeah.
And that's what your kid couldn't do. Maybe they could make the black canvas, but they couldn't tell you why they did it. They couldn't give you any kind of context or any kind of meaning for it.
Very well put.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the experience you have when you're at a museum.
Yes.
I was just thinking a little bit about it because last year I went to a modern art museum with someone who was they loved really realistic paintings. And as you like went up the levels, they got more and more abstract. And at the top, I was just like, it's just cool when there's so many of one thing. And we talk about that a lot about like when you're shopping, when you go to a bookstore.
Yeah.
I wasn't really talking about the museum, more trying to relate it to the actual bookstore. Because we often talk about like, why do we like going to chapters, or like what is it about the physical store? And I think it's similar to what it is about the physical or the collections of abstract paintings. Because often abstract art isn't just like a single piece of string. It's always these strings.
It's about the exhibit, right?
The exhibit,
it's about the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's about your presence there, which is, I mean, maybe that's another reason people don't like it, because they don't actually experience it. All they've ever seen of it are pictures online, which will obviously, that format is obviously going to make the Mona Lisa look better than it does that room of strings.
Yeah, exactly.
Good point.
But yeah, it's walking into it. And for anyone who maybe hasn't experienced, it's similar to walking into a chapters and being like, why do I want to buy all these books? But it's just like, there's something about the way things are displayed when there's a lot of something and there's intention in, that every single book has been thought about, every single black square or blue triangle has been thought about, placed together.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's what makes you excited to be there.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can keep going along those thoughts, because another piece that I wanted to mention, I didn't know the name of it, so I had to Google it, but I've always loved it, and I've never even seen it, obviously in real life, just images of it, and I learned a bit about it in one of my classes. It's by a New York artist called Robert Morris in the 60s, 1964, and it's untitled, so it's just nicknamed Corner Piece, because he did this exhibit, and it was these sculptures of, I think, just wood, all painted white, so it just looked like white shapes.
Yeah.
And I've always liked the idea behind this exhibit, as well as the actual pieces themselves by the looks of it. And I think it would have been really cool to go to. And it was just a triangle which was in the corner of a room. So where the two walls and the floor meet, it was just a triangle kind of supported there. Yeah. And I've always thought that looked really cool. And it's what made me think of the pyramids. I think this is a little bit more coming full circle than people seem to realize, or certainly than I kind of thought. And the thing with modern art, and especially sculptures, I think sculptures will be, let's say you have the most you said your friend who was a big fan of realist art. Yeah. Let's say you have the most kind of ardent naysayer for modern art. I think the best way of making them come around would be through sculptures. Yeah. Because you can see it from all kinds of angles, so maybe you get a little bit more immersed in it, or maybe you start to appreciate it a little bit more.
I feel like that did happen. I'm trying to remember the exact experience. I feel like that when you mentioned that, it was more easy to explain because you can talk about the materials then and the... Yeah. It's just that a perfectly rendered triangle is impressive, is the thing, which is why people or one of the reasons people like the pyramids, because there was skill involved. Yeah, there's just something about modern art, especially sculptures, which I think is just really beneficial to regard, to take in. I think that's why this triangle piece always seemed interesting to me, because I think it would really make you gain an appreciation for regular shapes that you see all around you. Yeah. We see a Da Vinci and we say that's incredible, but you don't see the things that he depicted in your day-to-day life. Yeah, exactly. So how much does it really change you and change your everyday appreciation of things? Whereas modern art can actually, if you stare at that for a while, you're going to start to notice every tiny little bump and ridge, or really, really straight line. And I just want to be one of those people who sees those shapes in real life and loves them, and gets a sense of peace from them. Yeah. And that's what nature does to us as well. And I think modern art's a good way of doing that. And that's also why I think showing it to kids is a great educational tool. It's interesting, to teach kids art, just kind of modern, then get more and more realistic. Then they would understand the shapes, the materials. I think that's awesome. I think so as well. Was it Warhol who painted like the Campbell soup? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's maybe an example of postmodernism, I suppose, because it's I think he is a postmodernist, but it's about consumerism and modern life in a kind of ironic way, whereas modernism was much more earnest and more functional. Yeah. Which maybe brings us into architecture, if you don't mind. Yeah, I don't mind. I do want to say one thing before we move on, because people might be thinking, oh, you're missing all these modern artists. Modern art only goes to like the 50s really, and then it becomes postmodernism or like contemporary art.
Okay.
Which I really think would be a discussion for like another day, kind of, because that would be internet consumerism.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hop into architecture.
I don't have much on architecture. It was mainly because we wanted to make this one point about politics. So architecture, my very brief timeline of it goes, there was modernism in the 1900s, which was function over form, function over everything. So getting rid of all the classical columns, carvings, nothing like that, just function. And then there was postmodernism, which was kind of self-awareness and kind of a deliberate riffs on historical styles and humor and irony, all those things, which we mostly don't like. The key materials for modernism especially was glass and cement, and that's what people criticize as maybe soulless and homogenized. And I just wanted to mention the politics of this divide, I guess, which is modernism versus modern architecture versus classical styles.
Yeah.
Or pre-1900 styles, I guess. The reason for this is because I was browsing a architectural Twitter account once, and I was like, man, I love all these classical styles.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be like a really far-right page.
Yeah.
And there was a lurking thread of xenophobia and racism, which I hadn't noticed immediately.
Yeah.
Because they do very well
They hide.
at hiding it. But the reason they don't like modern architecture is because it's a symbol of globalization to them.
Yeah.
It's they think it erodes places' individual identities.
Yeah.
What do you think to that?
I don't think it's like, I know that's what they say maybe. Oh, it erodes identities, but it's the root of it is they don't like people who are different than them.
Yeah.
They liked the good old days when there was the colonial houses and things in the United States.
Yeah, it's definitely not divorced from the actual context.
Yeah.
And what built those things and what they were used for and things like that, and the types of societies in which those places were built. I just thought this was interesting, this politicization of art. I think we've mentioned it before on the podcast about how the Nazis burned, any art which they deemed to be degenerate or hedonistic or whatever it was, which was mostly modern abstract art, if I recall.
Yeah, it was.
So that kind of far right leaning towards more realistic art and vice versa, I think is an interesting point to mention. And it also, you need both kinds of art, let's say that.
Yeah, of course.
What you don't need is intolerance towards either type of art.
Exactly.
That's the key point.
Yeah, but if you ever like encounter someone who's like really staunchly against modern art, maybe like dig a little deeper and be like
a little deeper, yeah.
Whoa, why?
Yeah, why?
And then maybe try and say, maybe you're a little bit racist.
Talking architecture though.
Yeah.
If we're just talking the aesthetics, this is why I was, browsing the Twitter account in the first place. I was like, I kind of agree with this. I do think a lot of glass, no one likes skyscrapers really.
No.
Glass ones anyway. I do think there's kind of I think there's an argument to be made that it's less durable. I don't see many of these surviving for centuries as have, the ruins of Greek buildings or some of them.
And I also think the lack of identity is interesting.
No, I think that's a key point. You don't want everywhere to look the same.
But we were looking at a skyline of somewhere in, was it the Netherlands?
No, actually I think it was Oslo.
Okay.
I think it was Oslo. In Norway.
Yes. And it's a very modern skyline. All the buildings are glass and cement.
Yeah, I think Scandinavia is kind of like the hub of modernist architecture.
Just look at that, because that's kind of like the in-between ground that we think is...
Yeah, it's rare that I see a kind of a modernist big city skyline with skyscrapers and everything and say that looks good or that looks unique. But with Oslo, I was like, that's a neat blend of the old and the new. So I don't think you should outlaw glass in buildings or skyscrapers for that matter.
Yeah.
But I do sympathize with the idea that
they don't have character, maybe.
That character is missing, and there is a bit of soul lacking in a lot of developments these days.
And I think we just need to be aware of that when we're designing things, because I don't think people nowadays are thinking, oh, we just want to make this 100% functional, like the early modernist architects would have, but they're just thinking, oh, this looks good, it's inoffensive, it's going to be timeless because it's just a sleek wall.
Yeah.
Because I was looking in the 30s and things, there were these homes being built by modernist architects who look like any modern home that we built today, and just like really square glass, always like overhanging water or a cliff or something. And I was like,
mid-century modern.
Yeah, I was like, that'd be spooky if you like walked into it in the woods and you're used to like really ornate or like wood houses and see this, because it looked really futuristic to me.
True. No, it does.
Yeah, but those had an element of personality. Just personality. Throw a little bit of spice in there.
Well, the other thing, we've talked about our campus before and how we don't like its architectural mismatch because it's such a collage of different styles. What do we make of that? Is that itself an unavoidable product of globalization, and not even globalization, that kind of weird effects that the internet has on culture, in that it stagnates it and accelerates it and blends it all at the same time?
I think what I've said about our campus before is just you need to have intention when you make a design choice.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Just think, okay, so this main building, which has been here for 200 years or whatever, looks like this. We're going to build a new building. Let's take a arch from that old one and mimic it in the glass entryway to this building. Like just taking one element from the old things. And even if the next building was built 100 years later, just take one element from the old one, make it all glass or something.
Yeah.
Just
uniformity in architecture will always look good. You know, if you have a town that's all mid-century modern, you say, wow, this looks really cool. Or a town which is all Gothic, you say, wow, this is very impressive. But it's when you have this kind of ugly and especially poorly planned mess of different styles that I think it starts to weaken the overall effect.
I think so.
We'll definitely have a big architectural episode in the future, because it's maybe even more of a modern thing.
I think so.
Than is paintings, because paintings you see at art exhibits.
Yeah.
You know, architecture you see all the time.
Yeah, and you interact with it a lot more, and it has an influence on your life.
Yeah.
I think architecture and sustainability are really closely connected as well. We haven't talked really at all about the environment, because like it would be a lot to try and talk about the environment and art. But again, climate change has been happening the last 100 years as modernism arose, and that is scary, and people were losing resources, suffering from shortages and conflict over resources, and this all arose at the same time.
Yeah. Any other artists which you wanted to mention, or pieces? I wanted to shout out Basquiat, because he's one of my favorite painters.
All right.
Pretty much love all his paintings. I think they're really, really cool, really modern, and just basically very, very appealing to the modern eyes, whatever that means. I don't know if he's technically postmodern or modern, because I think he was around in the 80s.
Yeah, it's probably postmodern, but I mean...
Yeah, he was around with Warhol at the same time.
Today I thought it'd be interesting to reach out to some of the Instagram accounts that we follow.
Okay.
To ask their opinion on modern art. Both of them, I reached out to 3 and 2 responded because it was kind of last minute. And they responded with very well thought out and, to me, informative responses, which I really appreciated. But they both kind of commented more on postmodern art, which is fine.
Yeah, that's awesome.
We'll probably inspire a future episode on that. But one of them mentioned how the internet was cool for sharing art and finding, like, kind of matching up the art with the viewer in a way that could never happen before. I think that's really neat.
Of course, because if you want to make a certain type of art, but you live in a town or city which doesn't like that certain type of art, you can pretty much always find your audience. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
As well as find other artists, which is a key thing.
I think that's like a positive of the internet. We often gripe about it and hate on it, mainly for like you can find people similar to yourself when you're this really hateful little scum.
Yeah. No, it's hugely democratizing for artists.
I think it's really neat.
I don't even think you can debate it. This is the best time in human history to be a creative person.
I think so.
Because you can, it's still difficult. It will always be difficult, but you can monetize it. You can share it, and you can learn pretty much better than ever before. So
I'm going to shout her out because I told her I would, and I like her page. So her name is XX Doodling Bish, which is just really funny.
Awesome.
And her bio is funny as well. And the other response talked about new art history, which was basically a movement that's come about from the 70s to today, trying to rewrite art history to make it less colonial, which I just think is really neat. And she referred me to some other cool resources, which I want to refer the people onto. Dr. Sam Rose wrote a paper on the fear of aesthetics.
Ooh.
And that talks about how aesthetics are very personal, but also they can be just misunderstood sometimes. So I suggest you read that if you want to learn more about.
Sounds like I'm going to read that. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, and she also wanted me to mention feminist perspective on modern art, because even today, after all of the movements in the 70s and throughout the last 120 years for female rights, they're still super, super underrepresented in exhibits, and even when they sell their paintings, they get way less money.
That's true. I don't think we mentioned a female artist.
We did not. And I was trying to find ones that were famous from like these movements, and there was like really, really early on one female artist.
Georgia O'Keeffe. You could have mentioned her.
You could have.
There was someone else in the video we were watching today.
That's what I was trying to think of. But she was like, what was she? It was like a scientific. She was painting like the color spectrum and stuff. Maybe we can feature her art this week for our inspiration, because it was really cool, but I didn't know about it till this morning. So
yeah, actually, we should call ourselves out for that. The video, the one video that we watched together in preparation, not that was the only research that we did, shouted a female artist out as forerunner for modern art. Yeah. And we both forgot her name, so probably that is an effect of our internalized
patriarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not even joking.
No.
So sorry about that.
Yeah, we're gonna do better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to mention that because
here's someone.
Yeah.
Gertrude Stein.
Oh.
She wrote Tender Buttons.
She did.
Which was a piece of modernist abstract literature. Yeah. Which is kind of a weird, strange book of poetry, which I adore.
You should read it. I didn't read I'm talking to the people.
Yeah, very thin. So it won't take you much time, but you will be the whole time questioning, why am I reading this? Or you'll be absolutely loving it along for the ride. Yeah. Because it's what some people call the genre of nonsense writing. Mm-hmm. The sentences don't make sense. There is seemingly no story. No.
The story is the experience.
But the effect of this little book, I find pretty magnificent. Mm-hmm. And Gertrude Stein, Tender Buttons, read that. If nothing else, you'll find some really funny and good quotes from it.
Exactly.
I think there was one about cheese, which I love. So I think that about wraps us up. Yeah. I have a poem to wrap us up, but this week I didn't write it. I basically pulled a Duchamp or a Picasso and I stole it from somewhere else, or I'm recycling it.
Queens.
This is a very famous poem, almost cliche poem when we're talking about modernist literature. Yeah. Which we didn't talk much about today because the episode just would have been too long, but maybe some other time. And I think it well sums up the art that we were extolling today. Yeah. It was by William Carlos Williams, and it's an example of early 20th century imagism, which is basically the start of literary or poetic modernism. Mm. And this style emphasizes really clear, distinct, vivid images, seemingly few metaphors, similes, or any of that kind of depth, I suppose. So it's about, just having an immediate effect, and it's supposed to be tangible, which is, I thought, very relevant to what we usually talk about. Yeah. So the poem goes like this. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. And I'm sure we've all heard that before, but, it's a good way to end the episode.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you guys for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. We really enjoyed making this episode, and we're probably going to talk about modern art all the way until next week's episode amongst ourselves. If you liked it and think someone else who would like this episode, or you want to say, hey, you should learn about this, just send them the link. Let them listen to it.
Yeah, you can find us on Instagram at @the_environmental, where we will be talking more about art, culture, history, and some science, as well as more explicitly environmental content as well. We have new episodes every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Do we know what next week's episode is going to be?
modern education.
Yeah, so we're continuing our Modern Times series and we're going from art to education, which is a very natural jump. Yeah, make sure you listen to that, guys, and we hope you all have a great
Day.